Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. We're continuing our discussion of Reconstruction, the era after the Civil War. And in the previous couple of lectures, we talked about the adjustment to freedom that was made by the freedmen, the freed slaves, in the aftermath of the war. In this lecture, we're going to talk about the white response of Southerners to the newfound freedom of the former slaves. It's hard to have much sympathy for the former Confederates and whites in the South in the aftermath of the Civil War. They had, after all, upheld the institution of slavery for centuries, leading to the beating, rape, and keeping down of millions of blacks who now struggled to find some sense of equality in the country. But we do have to keep in mind, while we might not necessarily be sympathetic to them, that everything that white Southerners had known was also thrown into disarray after the war. The white South bitterly resented Northern interference, congressional Reconstruction, and many of the things they were seeing during Reconstruction. Some blacks were holding political office. Blacks were gaining citizenship. There were black schools and churches, hints of social equality, even rare instances of intermarriage and relationships. The social order was overturned, and whites struggled for some semblance of the lives they knew before the war. When the sharecropping system and the black codes were not enough, some whites turned to violence and intimidation. So at its heart, the white reaction to the black adjustment to freedom came from a place of fear. They feared losing their land, losing their homes, losing their job. Again, some of them had lost their land in the aftermath of the war. They feared black violence. I made reference in a previous lecture to the fear of a slave rebellion. Well, this was the ultimate slave rebellion. They were now all freed. They also feared that blacks might seek out relationships with white women, and a fear that the purity of the white race would be undermined. These kind of things might sound ridiculous to us now, but they were rooted in centuries of a social system becoming so thoroughly ingrained in their minds that it was impossible to pry it free. They didn't think of the races as equal in any sense. White superiority was as ingrained a scientific fact as gravity. And so their response, as blacks attempted to achieve some semblance of equality in society, was in many cases to respond with violence. White violence and intimidation took many forms, but one that grew to be frighteningly common throughout the South were organizations such as the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan originated in Pulaski, Tennessee in 1865 or 66 as a social club. They gathered together, wore costumes, engaged in rituals common to various fraternal groups, and they were sort of pranksters in the beginning. In late 1866, they named Nathan Bedford Forrest as Grand Wizard. Forrest had been a slave trader prior to the Civil War and had participated in the Fort Pillow massacre of black prisoners in 1864. Under Forrest, violence became a driving motivation and theme of Klan activities. So there were many other organizations who carried out similar things. For the purposes of this discussion, when we refer to the Klan, it will refer collectively to these similar kinds of organizations. So why did whites turn to racial violence? Well, of course, one driving motivation was simply racism itself, the superiority or the believed and perceived superiority of whites. We also have to remember that many of these men had been hardened by the events of the Civil War. They had fought on the battlefields and seen men shot, maimed, wounded, and killed, and many of them lived with the scars of war themselves. So things that would strike us as horrifically cruel and violent some of the activities of the Klan, they were immune to having those thoughts about them after what they had seen in the war. They also had relatively little to no fear of punishment for a couple of reasons, one of which, as you see in this picture, they of course wore hoods and costumes and masks so that they simply couldn't be identified. But also, when we think about who was under that mask, in some cases or many cases, it might be a local law official or judge or someone who would otherwise bring them to justice, but they're participating in it. So there's little fear of punishment. Some of them engaged in violence as a kind of ritualistic protest against losing the war. This was their vengeance at losing the war. They're going to keep fighting. And as I described in the very first lecture about Reconstruction, the Colfax Massacre, this in some cases became a literal refighting of the Civil War. And finally, there is something in acting within a group which becomes at times a mob, where people do things in a group that they otherwise would not have done on their own. So one person without a mask and a costume face to face would never have engaged in the kind of activity that when you gather a whole group together, put them in masks and hoods, then they engage in horrific activities. For several years, the Klan became incredibly influential in the South. These various organizations preached hatred of blacks and came to dominate Southern society. They controlled politics, churches, and in many cases the law. It wasn't always just poor whites either. They had the tacit approval and sometimes even active participation of the upper classes as well. So what was a crime to the Klan? What kinds of things were they looking out for? Well, blacks acquiring too much property or power. I mentioned in a previous lecture those teaching in the Freedmen's Bureau schools or otherwise, teaching blacks could result in repercussions from the Klan. There was also a secular kind of nature to Klan crime. So if someone witnessed one crime, they might be the victim of the next. And then voting or registering to vote or running for office, participating in politics might lead to reprisals from the Klan. The Klan was very active from 1865 or 66 through about 1872 and helped to keep the balance of power in favor of whites. It began to decline in the early 1870s and really almost vanishes from view by 1872 for a couple of different reasons. One of them was the passage of the Klan Act, the KKK Act in 1871, which made membership in the Klan a federal offense. But in point of fact, that act was very hard to enforce for the reasons we've already talked about. People are wearing masks and hoods, and they're relatively anonymous. So there weren't very many prosecutions under the Klan Act. More likely, though, is that the Klan and its activities by 1872 were simply not necessary anymore to maintain white superiority. As we will talk about in the next lecture, Democrats were resurgent in the South and reclaiming control. And by 1871 or 72, the types of activity that I've described on this slide were much less common. Blacks were not acquiring as much property or power. They weren't running for office much anymore. They weren't voting or registering to vote. And so the Klan was simply not needed anymore, and thus it faded into obscurity. Now, as one final footnote, the Klan will return and does return in the United States in the mid-19-teens, a new and perhaps even more virulent strain of the Klan. But that, as they say, is a topic for another lecture.